So I'm going to record. Today we're starting the second book of the five books of Moses. It's called the Book of Shemot, or in English, the Book of Exodus. And it starts with the Book of Exodus, the Book of Shemot. You probably have noticed, if you're not already aware, that every book is the same name as the first parsha of that book, because both the names of the books and the name of the parsha gets the name from the first significant word of the book, which is also the first significant word, the parsha. So Parshat Shemot in Sefer Shemot, the Torah portion of Shemot in the book of Shemot, starts with Exodus 1:1, and it goes until 6:1. So the very first line of the sixth chapter is also part of this parsha, and then we go on. So Shemot literally means names, and we find it in the very first verse, the very first chapter. I'll tell you, I was listening to Jeremy Gimpel. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with him. He was saying this about this parsha, that this parsha is where we make the transition from the story of a family to the story of a nation. So the rest of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the year is about the nation, the Israelite nation. And so let me just do a quick summary. So um, we know that at the very beginning of this parsha, all of the tribes come to Egypt according to Joseph's command, and they live there for a couple of decades, and then they start to die. Okay. But as they're there, they become, from this group of 70 that originally came in with Yaakov, they become much, much larger group. Okay. So the children of Israel multiply very much in Israel. And Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, is very threatened by these growing numbers, and so this is where the enslavement begins. He enslaves them, and also orders the Hebrew midwives, who the text calls Shifra and Pua, to kill all male babies at birth, and they don't comply. And when he doesn't comply, Pharaoh says to the Egyptians as well to cast the male Hebrew babies into the Nile. Then we go on to chapter 2. A child is born to Yocheved. She is the daughter of Levi, and she has a husband named Amram. And Yocheved places this baby in the basket on the river. I know you know this basic story. We're going to go way deeper today. Um, while the baby's sister Miriam stands watching from afar, and Paro's daughter discovers the boy in the Nile. She raises him as her own son, and she's the one who names him Moshe. As a young man, Moshe leaves the palace one day, and he discovers how the Israelite nation, his brethren, are suffering. And he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he kills the Egyptian. The next day, he sees two Jews, well, they're not Jews, two Israelites fighting. And when he admonishes them, they reveal that they know that he killed the Egyptian the day before, and he is forced to flee. And he flees to some place called Midian, which is in today's northern Saudi Arabia. Okay. And there he rescues. Now, I think you probably call this character Jethro. We call him Yitro. Some people call him Yisro. Um, and he marries one of the daughters of Yisro, and he becomes a shepherd to his father-in-law's flocks. That should sound familiar to you because there's somebody else that did that. And then God appears to Moses at the in a burning bush at the foot of Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, and he tells him to go to Pharaoh and to demand, let my people go so that they may serve me. And Moshe and his brother Aaron are appointed, well, Aaron's appointed to serve as his spokesman. And in Egypt, Moshe and Aaron get all the elders of Israel together to tell them that the time of their redemption has come. And the people believe him, but Pharaoh refuses to let them go, and he even makes things worse, intensifies their suffering. And at the end of the Parsha, Moshe returns to God to protest and said, why are you doing harm to this people? And God says, don't you worry, son. I'm paraphrasing. He said, but redemption is close at hand. Okay. So that's the overview. What we're going to focus on are four female, actually five female characters in this story, because one of the themes that we see in the life of Moshe, in the life of Moses, over and over and over again, women save his life. Okay, so we're going to start with the Mialdot. These are the Hebrew midwives who in the text says Shifra and Pua. We're now in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verses 8 through 12. Um, no, I'm sorry. That's the preliminary stuff there. A new king comes in who doesn't know Joseph. He announces all the stuff I just told you. The Israelites are becoming too numerous. We have to deal wisely with them. And so we're going to enslave them. And the more that the Egyptians enslaved them, the more they proliferated and spread, and there became this tension. So Pharaoh issues his first of three decrees of harsh labor. Okay, in verse 1, chapter 13. And this is why I asked you if you would have a text in front of you so that you can follow along. I will read you a translation, but I want you to understand because sometimes we're going to dive a little bit into the Hebrew. The Egyptians started to make the Israelites do labor that was designed to break their bodies. They made the lives of the Israelites miserable with harsh labor involving mortar and bricks, as well as all kinds of work in the field. All the work they made them do was intended to break them. There was there was no functional part of what they were doing. They were pressed into slavery just for the purpose of breaking their will and breaking their desire to have more children. Nevertheless, they continue to grow in a miraculous way because, according to our tradition, routinely at this time, the Hebrew slave women were having multiple children. And I don't mean two or three, I mean five or six at in a supernatural way in each time that they gave birth. So along comes a second decree. The first decree is harsh labor. The second decree is infanticide. Now we're in chapter 1, verses 15 to 16. And here's where we meet the Mialdot, the Hebrew midwives. Okay. So, chapter 1, verse 15, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, spoke to the chief Hebrew midwives whose name were Shifra and Pua. Okay. Now, there's a couple of opinions about who they are. There's one very strong opinion in our tradition, but some say that these midwives were Israelites. Okay. And the Talmud associates them with Yocheved and Miriam. Who are Yocheved and Miriam? They are the mother and the daughter of Moses, respectively. Now, Moses is not yet born in the story yet. He's not born until chapter 2, but this is the family of Moses. Okay. Others say that they were Egyptian women. So the verse would be translated not the Hebrew midwives, but the midwives in charge of the Hebrews. And now, because these women were routinely having many children at one time, they needed assistance for these multiple births that were going on because they routinely gave birth to five or six children at a time. Now, these two women, however you understand Shifra and Pua, we'll talk about them more. They're obviously not the only midwives for the entire nation. They were like the managers. They were the overseers under whose direction other midwives worked. Shifra, the name Shifra, which is a popular name for women today, is was called Shifra, according to one opinion, because she beautified the newborn infants. So the name Shifra is spelled Shin Pei Resh He, and the word mishaperet, which means to beautify, is Mem Shin Pei Resh Taf. So they're very similar. Shifra, mishaperet, you can almost hear it. And what does it mean that she cleaned up the babies after with the blood and the afterbirth after delivery and made them beautiful. Pua, which is a much less common Hebrew name today, although there isn't I believe it's called PUA. There's an organization today that does work with women who have fertility issues in Israel, and it's called Machon PUA, which is like the PUA organization, named after this biblical character. PUA was so called because she cried. This is my best imitation of what it sounds like. PUA, PUA. She was cooing to the babies. Like if you have an infant that's crying and you're trying to calm them down. She played with the infants to try to soothe them and amuse them. There's also an opinion that she had a special, the rabbis call it an incantation, like some special words or something that she said that would draw the infant out from the woman's body. And Pua, according to one opinion, is associated with Miriam because she cried out with prophecy, saying, "My mother will give birth to the Savior of the Israelite nation." That's why she's associated with Miriam. Okay, so we're going on to the next verse, chapter 1, verse 16. Paro says to them, "When you deliver Hebrew women, you must look carefully at the birth stool. If it is an infant, if the infant is a boy, kill it, and if it's a girl, let it live." So the word for birth stool in Hebrew, avnaim, literally means twin stones. And even is a stone. And so these are two stones. So apparently in those days, women gave birth standing up so that when the baby was delivered, I guess they leaned on this birth stool. I'm not an expert on ancient birthing methods, but that the baby was delivered between the birth stool. And that's where the midwife would like catch the baby. But others translate this verse to say you must look between their rigid, that is stone-like legs. That's the Avnayim, that's the reference to stone in this verse, in order to detect whether it's a boy or a girl that they have given birth to. And another opinion is that Pharaoh instructed them to feel the legs of the women in labor, and when the legs began to get hard and cold like stone, that was a sign that birth would be imminent, and that technique would help them locate and kill the boys. Now, Abnaim, another way of understanding that is this miracle that God performed for the Israelite women, because normally giving birth to multiple children like that is very painful and very difficult and almost beyond the woman's ability to physically endure it. But God made their bodies as tough and insensitive to pain as stone. That's another opinion about this important word. Um, some say that the two stones refers to the fact that the stones would melt and coalesce into one because of the great pain that the women were in. But in any case, this was what was going on. Now, the second, I'm going to speak as if the Mealdot, as if the midwives are in fact Yocheved and Miriam is very young at this point. She's only 5 years old, and as soon as she hears the decree uh, that Pyro is there addressing. Imagine this scene. Pyro comes to wherever they are, wherever the head midwives are, and says to them, if it's a boy, you should kill it. If it's a girl, you can let it live. And Miriam shouts out, "What a wicked king! Woe to you on the day God will punish you." And Pyro wanted to have her killed in that moment. But her mother fell down on her face and pleaded and entreated for mercy on behalf of her daughter. And she said, "Why would you be angry at the words of this little girl? She's only a child." And so we know, of course, that Paro consented to let Miriam live. Um, in his sort of sick instructions, was this idea that he thought that since he's asking the midwives to kill the babies, he's not going to bear responsibility for the burdens. They will, because they're for the murders, because they're the ones who are actually doing the murdering according to his plan and strategy. He only cared about the males because the astrologers of that time, Egypt had a pretty sophisticated system of astrology, and the astrologers told him that there was a son that was destined to be born who would save the Israelite slaves. And Paro wants to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's why he calls for the elimination of every boy baby born to the Israelite nation at birth, so they can't grow up and redeem their people. Okay, so we know that God has bigger plans. Okay, so we know how it worked out. But there, if the if Paro intended to prevent the Israelites from multiplying, which was one of his concerns, then he would have decreed, it would have made more sense for him to decree that the females, rather than the males, be put to death, because the destruction of the males, like one male can impregnate many, many females. So unless you kill every single male that's born, you still are going to have pregnancies. But if that was his concern, but that wasn't his concern. His concern was responding to what the astrologers said. There's the somebody is going to be born to the Israelite people, and he's going to be the redeemer. Now, um, the second part of that verse is, but if it's a girl, let it live. So the midwives have permission to let girls live. Um, but it's not necessarily a good thing. He's not saying that out of the kindness of his heart. The plan was to keep the girls alive so that they could be married off to, AKA raped by the Egyptians. But in any case, the intention was to kill all the boys and to make the girls become part of Egyptian society. And so he's trying to prevent a redeemer from coming forward and also wipe out um, this nation in a generation. Okay. The next verse tells us, however, that the midwives feared God and they did not do as the Egyptian king ordered them, and they allowed the infant boys to live. Now, it would have been sufficient to say that the midwives did not do as the Egyptian king had ordered them. The addition of they allowed the infant boys to live tells us something more. And one of those things is, according to one opinion, that they didn't just let them live, but they helped them thrive. That they did all they could to enable the boys to live, providing food, even more than they had done in the past, because they did not want to be accused of doing what Paro has asked them. So they want to make sure, as much as possible, that no infant boys die on their watch. And so they're not just delivering them, but they're doing everything that they can to enable them to live. Okay, so they're supplying needy children with nourishment and taking care of them. They would collect food from the homes of the richer women, bringing it to those of the poorer women. Also, before every delivery, they would pray that all the children should be born healthy, because if a child was born handicapped, that the Israelites might suspect that the midwives were doing, maybe they were doing something to the newborn before giving it to the mother to cause it to be handicapped. They also prayed that the mothers don't die in childbirth, so that the midwives shouldn't be blamed for their deaths. Okay, so in this way, Shifra and Puah really did grant life to these Israelite children. Okay. Um, Another understanding of they did not do as the Egyptian king had ordered them. In Hebrew, it says alehen, to them. Um, but since it was not followed by a direct quote, it should say lahen. What is it the midwives didn't do? Um, One opinion is that Pyro, this is so gross, but he solicited them for sexual favors and they refused to be with him sexually. Okay. So somehow for some period of time, they get away with it. And then the king, the Paro, summons them and he demands, why did you do this? Why did you let the infant boys live? You're liable to death for disobeying my command. And so this is the next piece of it is like so clever how they answer him. They say to him, and I'm in chapter 1, verse 19, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptians. This is what they say to him. They know how to deliver. They can give birth before a midwife even gets to them. So they're saying, we didn't disobey your orders. But the Hebrew women are very vigorous. They are referred to in as ha'ivriot kichayot. Ha'ivriot kichayot means that the Hebrew women are like animals, meaning animals give birth without a midwife. And the language it's such a clever thing. It feeds into the notion that Paro has that the Hebrew slaves are something less than fully human. Okay. So, so they go on and they say the Israelites are not stupid. They're fully aware that you gave us these marching orders for killing off the newborn males, and since they could do without us anyway, they stopped calling us. That's why boys are being born, because it doesn't have anything to do with the fact. Now, they go on to say, now we also realize that the fact that we supplied food for the newborns makes us look suspicious, but we didn't do that out of love for the children. This is their argument. He says, we saw the women no longer were calling us because they suspected that we were going to kill their male children. So we devised this plan. We thought we would get a reputation for providing food for poor families, and that would be like encouragement for them to call us when they need a midwife, and then we'd be able to obey your orders and kill the babies. You see, the whole thing is a whole pack of lies, but it's so clever. Um, it's so clever, and he buys it. Okay. And then the next verse says, God was good to the midwives, and the people increased and became very numerous. So if you read this, you might think that what this verse means is that um, the benefit to the midwives was that the people increased and became very numerous. But that's not true, because we have to look at the next verse. The benefit to the midwives was not this idea of the people increasing and becoming very numerous. When the midwives revealed to Pharaoh, that the Hebrew women gave birth without their assistance, um, Paro um, didn't believe them at first. So God blessed the Hebrew women, and they multiplied considerably, and proving that they didn't need the help of the midwives. Because um, if they did, then two midwives would not have sufficed. So God benefited them. Basically, he's corroborating their story and also increasing the size of the nation. It says, according to one opinion, that the Israelites at this stage multiplied so fast um, that the Hebrew midwives couldn't be suspected of committing infanticide. If the birth rate had declined, then the people might have suspected them. But in the next verse, it talks about what the reward was. Because the midwives feared God and therefore didn't do what Pharaoh asked them to do, he, meaning God, gave them great houses of their own. That's what it literally means. He made them houses. What does that mean? There's a bunch of different opinions. One is that Pharaoh set up clinics for them, so the Hebrew women would not be able to deliver at home. They'd have to go to this clinic. They would have to use the services of the Hebrew midwives. Another opinion, he made them houses, means that um, when the Hebrew midwives disobeyed Pharaoh's orders to kill the male infants, he constructed houses for them to guard them and prevent them from going out to deliver babies, to make sure, since they weren't doing their job. Another opinion, he made them houses for the he made houses for the Hebrews among the Egyptians. In other words, he made them live among the Egyptians, and up until this time, they had been living separately. But he made them houses in like Egyptian neighborhoods, so that the Egyptians would know when the Hebrew women were about to give birth. Another opinion is that when the midwives revealed to Pharaoh that the Hebrew women were giving birth without the assistance of midwives, initially Pharaoh did believe them, but after they left, he regretted he believed them, and so he sent soldiers to have them arrested. But God performed a miracle for them, and they became invisible to Pharaoh's soldiers. They were swallowed up by the walls of their home. That's another opinion of what it means, how God protected them by making them houses. Um, there's another opinion, a more long-term opinion, that he made them houses means that they also received eternal reward. So Miriam, who is Pua, one of the two Meildot, one of the two Hebrew midwives, later on she marries Caleb, from the tribe of Yehuda, from the tribe of Judah, and she becomes therefore in the line of the house of David. Yocheved becomes this is the mother of Moses. She becomes the mother of the first high priest, who is Aaron, the first Levi, who is her son Moshe, who isn't born yet, and she becomes like the head of the house, or the foremother of all of the Kohanim and Levim, which is very significant because they still exist in Jewish life today.
To the other one. So I took a couple of these and my nose ain't itching anymore.
Andrea, can you mute
Is
yourself?
that Benadryl, but it don't.
It is.
Can you remember that?
I know what it is.
Hello?
Okay. All right. I think I did it. All right. Here's so the first decree is harsh labor, the second degree is infanticide, the third decree is throwing boys into the Nile. So Paro then, now we're in verse 22, chapter 1, verse 22. Paro then gives orders to all his people. Every boy who is born must be cast into the Nile, but every girl shall be allowed to live. So now it says he gave orders to all his people. Now we're not just talking about him talking to the Israelites. The original decree the second decree was directed only to the midwives, but now he's commanding all of his people to execute this plan. He's commanding all the Egyptians to assist him by casting Jewish firstborn males into the Nile. But there's another opinion. Okay, so remember the whole thing about the astrologers. There's this whole black magic thing going on in Egypt. And on the day that Moshe is born, and he hasn't been born yet, but on the day that he is born, the astrologers tell Pharaoh, today the one who's going to save them has been born, but we don't know whether he was born from the Egyptians or from the Israelites, but we see that ultimately he will be smitten with water. Okay, so they see like sort of this incomplete transmission. They didn't know ultimately, this is way many, like in the book of Numbers, that Moshe will eventually suffer. That is, he wouldn't be allowed to enter the Holy Land because of the water of Meribah. That's way, way ahead. But the uncertainty about we don't know if he's from the Egyptians or from the Israelites is because of what's going to come next, which is he's born from the Hebrews, but he's raised by the daughter of Paro who adopts him. And so he's kind of Israelite and he's kind of Egyptian. So it's a little confusing for them. So they saw signs in the stars that he was sort of Egyptian and sort of Hebrew. And so now he's increased his order that on this one day, he's saying that since his astrologers have informed him that the one destined to save the Hebrews has been born on this day, now they're not sure if he's a Hebrew or an Egyptian. So he's saying on that day, Paro says any Egyptian baby that male that's born on this day has to be drowned in the Nile, just like the Hebrew babies. Okay. um, okay. Now let's look at chapter 2 and meet Yocheved, who actually isn't named in the first verses here. Chapter 2, verse 1, a man went from the house of Levi and he took a daughter of Levi. Okay, so a man went from the house of Levi. This is Amram, whose father's name is Kahat and his grandfather's name is Levi. Okay, so Amram, who will be Moshe's father, is the grandson of Levi. Levi is, of course, one of the original 12 tribes. And because there were so many Israelites, they lived in many cities. Okay. And so a man went from the house of Levi is an indication that he went from one city where he lived to another city to take the daughter of Levi. A man went from the house of Levi. So there's a whole other opinion that Amram and Yocheved, Moshe's parents, but he's not born yet, that they were already married. And Miriam was already born and Aaron was already born, the two older siblings. Okay. And the tradition is that he separated from his wife so she would not bear any more children because the Egyptians were out to kill all of the male children, as we just described at length. And because Amram was a leader among the Israelites, all of the other Israelite men followed suit and they separated from their wives. And little Miriam, who's not only a prophetess but also not afraid of speaking up to authority, she says three things to her father about why his decree of having the men separate from their wives is harsher than what Paro has decreed. She said, number one, Paro issued a decree only against males, but you issued a decree against females because if husbands and wives are separated, no females are going to be born. Also, Paro only decreed concerning this world, whereas you decreed concerning this world and the world to come. What does that mean? The babies that drowned, their bodies drowned in this world, but their souls, having come into this world, would have a life in the world to come. But an unborn child, a child that's never conceived, that's never born, even if it dies at childbirth, can't enter the world to come because they've never been in this world. And in the third, she says, Paro is a wicked man, and there's some doubt whether his decree is going to be fulfilled or not, but you're a righteous person, and so your decree will be fulfilled. Okay. So um, Amram um, takes her advice, and a man went from the house of Levi means that he went back to his wife Yocheved and he remarried her. Whenever somebody in the Torah performs an act of daring or that requires courage, it's described in the Torah with this concept of going. Now, what was Amram's daring act? That he disregarded Paro's decree and he remarried his former wife, and he risked the birth of a son whose life would be endangered by Paro's decrees. I feel like I'm going really fast because there's so much material here. Can you just let me know, are you with me? Is this pace too fast for you? Is anybody want to say anything? You're okay? You guys are okay? Give me a thumbs up if you're with me. Okay. All right. Okay, good. All right. Now, when it says he took a daughter of Levi in the second part of this verse, it should have said he took her back since they had been married before. But the way that they got remarried was openly with like a big party, as though it was a first marriage. And our tradition says that Aaron and Miriam, the children that were already born, that they danced at this remarriage of their parents. It was a big deal. And that the nation should see not just the bravery of Amram for reuniting with his wife, but that they should follow along and that husbands and wives should reconnect with each other. Okay, this daughter of Levi, we know that this is Yocheved. We know that this is also Shifra, the one of the Mialdot, one of the midwives, but also she's described as a daughter of Levi. And um, I might have mentioned this last week, but as the caravan, the original 70 families were coming into Egypt when Yosef calls his family back to come and live with him in Egypt. She is born just as the caravan was arriving in Egypt. Now, there's a principle here that I want to teach you. It's called um, refuah lifnei maka, which means that God prepared the refuah, the healing, before the maka, which is the plague. What does that mean? Before the Israelites would be enslaved in Egypt, God has already brought into the world the woman who will give birth to the Redeemer. Okay, so she's counted as one of the 70 souls that come into Egypt. Now remember that the slavery didn't start right away, but already she exists. And she's going to give birth to Moshe, who is the Redeemer. So it's a principle. We learn this principle from this story. Just sorry, I'm just turning down the heat in the office a little bit. Um, but the idea is when there is something bad happening in the world, that the cure for it already exists. That Hashem has already created the cure. It may not be revealed, but it already exists. And that's something that we get a lot of spiritual strength from. It's not like we fully understand how God runs his world, but we do understand that when there is a makkah, when there is a difficulty, when there is a literally a plague, but not necessarily only a plague, that the solution for it already exists in the world. I find that a very powerful spiritual concept that comes from here, from the fact that Yocheved was born as the caravan was crossing into Egypt. Okay. Um, Now, here's something interesting. At this time, according to our tradition, she was 130 years old when she remarries her husband. He takes her back, he marries her a second time, and she is transformed physically to be like a young woman, even though she was 130 years old. How do we derive that she's 130? She was born when they came into Egypt, and they were there for 210 years. And when they left, Moshe was 80 years old. And so she conceived him, if you do the math, when she was 130. But scripture still refers to her as a daughter of Levi, which is the way we talk about young women. Okay. Yocheved became like a young woman. Now, this should sound familiar to you. Her youthful facial features returned to her, her skin smoothed out, she regained her menstrual cycle. And that's why she's referred to here as a daughter of Levi. Um, Now, here's the relationship. There's Levi, who's one of the 12 tribes. He has four children: Gershon, Kahat, Ma'ari, and Yocheved. And Kahat, who's Yocheved's brother, has a son named Amram. Yocheved is actually Amram's paternal aunt. Okay, so she's a generation older than her husband. In the text at this point, Amram and Yocheved's names are not even mentioned. It's just called a man of Levi and a daughter of Levi, even though she's technically older. But I think that's a reference to the youthfulness that gets restored to her. But if you look ahead in chapter 6, verses 16 through 20, there we find a fuller account, the names of Levi's son, and the fact that in chapter 6, verse 20, Amram took Yocheved, his aunt, as his wife, and she bore him Aaron and Moshe, and the years of Amram's life were 137 years. Okay. Later on, also in Bamidbar, which is the Bamidbar is the book of Numbers, in, if you want to look it up, later, chapter 26, verse 59, the name of Amram's wife was Yocheved, daughter of Levi, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the text that we're looking at just refers to him as a man from Levi, and she's a daughter of Levi, but we know later on what their names are. Now, there's an opinion there's a sort of interesting that 3 years from the time Amram divorces Yocheved, separates from her, and the time he remarries her is a period of 3 years. And during that time, according to one opinion, she married someone else. And she gave birth to two sons whose names were Eldad and Medad. Do those names ring a bell with you at all? Eldad and Medad? You will find them in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 26. So this is way down in the story. They are grown men at this point. And they are going around the camp and they are prophesying. And Moshe's son runs to tell Moshe, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Yehoshua, who is the servant of Moses, says also, like, you shouldn't let them get away. I'm paraphrasing. You shouldn't let them get away with this. You should put them in prison. And Moshe says, are you kidding me? I wish all of my people were prophets. I wish that God would bestow his spirit on everybody. So they didn't get in trouble for that, even though some people thought it was inappropriate for them. It's unclear whether Moshe treated them like his elder half brothers or not, but I just thought that was an interesting aside. Okay, but let's go back to the story of, she's still not named, but we know that it's Yocheved. In verse 2, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. She saw that it was good and she hid him for 3 months. Okay, she gave birth to a son. Now, there's no mention made in the text of the births of Miriam and Aaron because there's nothing unusual about their births, but there's a few things that are unusual about this birth. Now, here's a question. We talked about the fact that she was 130 and the signs of youth were restored to her. But if you go back to the story of Sarah, she gives birth at the age of 90, which is 40 years younger. And the Torah emphasizes what a great miracle it is. And Yocheved giving birth at 130 is a much greater miracle because it's so many years later. Why doesn't the Torah even mention it? So the rabbis say that the Torah only relates miracles that were predicted by a prophet and performed by a prophet, or those performed by an angel, or predicted by an angel who reveals himself to be on a godly mission. So in Sarah's case, if you remember, an angel predicted childbirth for her at the age of 90, and that miracle is recorded. But we should be aware that there is a miracle going on here, that Yocheved is able to have another child at the age of 130. Now, when it says she saw that it was good, he was good, what were some of the signs that Yocheved understood this is not a typical child? Number one, the entire house, it says, when Moshe was born, the entire house was filled with light. He was also, according to the majority opinion, he was born after the 6th month of pregnancy. And Yocheved was unsure whether he would be viable or not. Even today, a child that's born at 6 months gestation if they survive, they need intensive medical care. But she carefully examined him and saw that he had nails and he had hair, which are signs of viability. And so she figured, all right, this kid's going to make it. And so she goes to hide him. She also noticed that he was very hardy looking. Children born that early are usually weak, and he was sturdy and robust, even more than full-term infants sometimes. And another opinion, she saw that he was good. Miriam prophetically named him Tov, which is literally the Hebrew word for good, or Tuvia, which means goodness, another male name. Um, Also, this is a very interesting tradition that he was born circumcised. There were not too many stories of people that were born circumcised, but that Moshe was born already circumcised. That was a sign of great inner perfection. Also, there's an opinion that he was able to speak when he was just a few hours old. On the same day that he was born, he had a conversation with his parents. So all of these supernatural signs were an indication that this is not a typical child, but that in fact the prophecy of Miriam that her mother is going to give birth to the Redeemer appears to be coming true now. Now she needs to hide him. Um, she's trying to hide him from the Egyptians so they don't kill him. And the text says she hid him for 3 months. She's able to do that because the Egyptians started counting her pregnancy after she remarried. So one opinion is that she was actually already 3 months pregnant. So the Egyptians weren't looking for a child for 3 months. The other opinion is that he was born at 6 months gestation. Um, Okay, so now 3 months have passed. She cannot hide him any longer because now the Egyptians know that she's expecting to have a child. So what does she do? According to the text, she takes a wicker basket. This is where the thing that I posted about Moshe Bateva, the hot dog in a bun, comes from. Not, that's what we call them in Israel, Moshe B'Teva instead of pigs in a blanket. Okay. She takes this basket, she smears it with clay and pitch, and she puts the child in it and places it among the reeds at the bank of the river. Now, here's what the Egyptians would do to try to ferret out babies. They would take other babies to the home where they think that there's a newborn and make the Egyptian baby cry by pinching it or something. And then when they cried, the hidden baby would cry. And in that way, they would find a bunch of hidden babies. But she knows that she can't hide him any longer, so she's looking for some other system. So she makes this basket. She puts it in the water. I can't even imagine as a mother what it takes. She's trying to save him, but in order to save him, she has to um, turn it over. Like the amount of amuna, the amount of faith that this woman had it's just incredible. Now, there's an opinion that she made the basket and then stationed Miriam away. Miriam was a young girl at the time still, so nobody would recognize her, but she could report back to the mother what happens to the basket. Okay. Um, the there's different opinions of what the basket is made out of, what the materials were, um, how it looked. For example, there's an opinion that the outside of the basket was left rough so that to all outward appearances, it would look like just like a bundle of reeds floating down the water. Um, but there's another opinion that she crafted it in such a way that somebody walking along the bank of the Nile wouldn't be able to see it, but somebody in the water would be able to see it. And that is, in fact, how he is discovered. We'll get to that in a minute. So she places the child in it. Um, and and then she disappears because she doesn't know if this is going to be the end. She's ever going to see this child again. Um, she doesn't know if the child's going to die, if he's going to get killed, if he's going to drown, whatever. Um, but she places her trust in God. And um, now Yocheved is kind of banking on the fact that when the Egyptian astrologers sense, however they understand this sort of stuff, they sense that the baby that is born on that day is supposed to um, redeem the Israelites and is supposed to meet his end through water was placed in the water. She was hoping to confuse them and make them think that this prospective redeemer had already met his end, and they would stop searching for him. And they would also rescind the decree to drown Israelite babies. She knew that their visions were very imprecise and subject to misinterpretation. So, as soon as he was placed in the water, she was hoping that they would assume that he had drowned. Now, there's some parallels between Yocheved and Hashem that I just want to point out to you. In Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 1, verse 4, it says, God created that it talks about God creating good. He saw that the light was good, and Yocheved creates her own good, this baby Tov, who later is going to get the name Moshe. And to protect his good, now we're this is the story of Noah, that God orders the construction of an ark in the time of Noah, which is called a teva, and Yocheved builds a teva to protect her good. So God creates a world, calls it good. Yocheved creates a baby or gives birth to a baby, calls it good. God orders the construction of a teva, of an ark, in the time of Noah to protect what his good is, and Yocheved builds a teva to protect the good that she gave birth to. You see the parallels? Okay. Now there's a question here that I do not have an answer to, but I don't know where Amram is when all of this is going on. Aaron is a young boy. He's maybe 3. Miriam's maybe 5 or some. She's also young. Yocheved and Miriam are the active ones in this story. They were the ones responsible for saving Moshe and not Amram because he disappears from the scene. So I don't know what the story is about that. I'm gonna we're not going to be able to finish everything, but I want to talk to you about the story of Batya. We're going to have to save the Tzipora story, I guess, for next week because it's just too much. I knew when I was preparing it that it was too much for one class. But okay, so now Moshe's been saved in effect twice. Once by the Mialdot, once by the Hebrew midwives who make it possible for him even to be born. Okay. And the second time by his mother and his sister who protect him for the first 3 months and then create a scenario where he can be saved from this decree by placing him in the basket in the Nile. Now what happens? Now you know this part of the story, but let's just go a little bit deeper. So chapter 2, verse 5, she is only referred to as Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe by the river, and her maidens walked along the river. She took the basket, she saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maidservant to take it. Okay, so remember I said that the way that Yocheved built the basket, whatever you call it, the teva, was that those walking alongside the Nile wouldn't be able to see it. You'd have to actually be in the water to see it. So Paro's daughter was bathing in the Nile. She saw it, but the women, her handmaidens, whatever, who were walking alongside, they didn't see it. The text says that Paro's daughter went down. What does that mean? It says she went down from her palace. There's a couple of opinions. What was she doing at the Nile River that morning? One is that she had like some kind of skin disease, like sores or something, and she couldn't tolerate hot water, so she went down to the Nile to cool off. But there's another opinion, which I actually like much better, is more consistent with what we know about her character, and that is that she went down and used the Nile almost like a mikvah to cleanse herself of her father's idols. Some say that she was immersing herself as part of the process of converting. Now, there's no Torah given yet. What is she converting to? We're not exactly sure, but Paro and the Egyptians worshipped the Nile as if it were a god. And his daughter, the daughter of Paro, realized that was there's like idol worship is not a healthy thing, and there's no value in worshiping a river. So she's down there and she sees the basket among the reeds. As soon as the maidens that were with her saw that she wanted to save this baby, they said to her, when a king makes a decree, usually the people follow it. But even if the people don't follow it, certainly the members of their household, of the king's household, follow it. But you're transgressing your father's decree. And according to the Talmud, at that moment, the angel Gabriel comes and he kills them. Okay, like shut them right down. Now, if you look back in the text, if you look at the verse, first it refers to the maidens in the plural, and then it says that there's a maidservant left. So the maidens, the multiple ones, they're dead because they can't be trusted to keep the secret, but there's one left, and um, the this there's different opinions here. In Hebrew, the word that's used is amma, which can mean a maid, but it also means an arm. It's also a biblical measurement, and amma is a biblical measurement. So one opinion is that the remaining maidservant went to get the basket, and another opinion is that Batya's arm, sort of like Pinocchio's nose, grew lengthened like unnaturally so that she could reach the basket. Okay, she stretched forth her hand. It wasn't an actual person, a maidservant, it was her arm, because the word in Hebrew is a little has two meanings. You okay? And in fact, that is, as you can imagine, when we teach our children this story, it has a kind of like a fairy tale aspect to it, that the daughter of Paro stretched out her hand and her hand grew and her arm grew and grew and grew and all the way to be able to reach the basket. So the truth is that maybe there was a maidservant or maybe it was just her arm, but no one else in the palace knew about this. Okay, so later on, when Yocheved brings Moshe back, no one knows where he's come from. But how does she know what's in this ark? So you look at chapter 2, verse 6. She opened it, the ark, the basket, and she saw him, the child, and behold, a youth was crying. She took pity on him and she said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Now, she opened it and she saw him, the child, so she saw what she expected to see. She figured it out that the basket had been placed in the Nile by one of the Hebrew women in the hope of saving a newborn infant. She saw the basket. She decided she wanted to save the child. Okay. She wasn't surprised to see a child. That's that's what she expected to see because she figured it out. But there's another reading. And she opened it and she saw him, comma, the child, meaning the him is God, that she saw the presence of God, um, or a great light, or something that God provided in order to make this baby seem very important and special in her eyes, so that she would want to save him. There's an in the Hebrew, he's referred to first as a child and then a youth. But all right, so a child in Hebrew is a yeled. That's the name for a boy. And a na'ar is an older boy. Okay. In the Hebrew, first it says child. In English, you can even see it. It says child and then youth. I don't know what it says in your translation, but he was obviously not yet 13 because he's still an infant. So the word nar is not the right word to use. He is a child, but he had the voice of an older boy. Okay. Um, and again comes the angel Gabriel, and when she's in the vicinity, according to this opinion, the angel Gabriel strikes him to cause him to weep out loud so that she would take pity on him. He didn't permanently have this deep voice. God temporarily made his voice loud and deep so that she would hear his cries and decide that she's going to take care of him. He is also called a youth because his limbs were well formed, like those of an older child. So you know how like babies are kind of floppy and like when they're newborn. I'm sure there's a technical name for that, but anyway, he apparently was hardier than that. And so the text tells us that she took pity on him, and she knew that he was one of the Hebrew boys. How did she know? So one way she knew is that She wanted to see whether it was a male or a female. She saw that it was a male and also circumcised, because remember, I told you that he was born circumcised, so she knew he had to be a Hebrew child. There's another opinion. She didn't have to undress him to check out his genitalia. She understood from the circumstances that his mother placed him in a basket to save him or to spare herself the anguish of seeing the Egyptians drown her son. So she knew that it had to be a child. Okay. Now Miriam comes onto the scene. This is now we're in chapter 2, verse 7. And she says to Paro's daughter, remember, Paro's daughter still doesn't have a name. She said, I'm just looking at the time. I'm hoping I can finish this little piece. She says, shall I go and summon for you a wet nurse from the Hebrew women who will nurse the boy for you? Now, obviously, Paro's daughter can't nurse the boy, and you can't just go to the grocery store and buy formula in Egypt in that time. Okay. But what the lesson is that they actually tried, they called a Hebrew wet, I'm sorry, an Egyptian wet nurse, but Moshe would not suckle from her. Um, and so Miriam realizes that she's going to need help. The daughter of Paro is going to need help. And so she offers to get a wet nurse specifically from among the Hebrew women. And the daughter of Paro says, yeah, go do that. I'm in verse 8, chapter 2, verse 8. And who does she go to? She goes to her mother, and brings her mother back. Okay. Um, and Paro's daughter, what does she say? She says, take this boy and nurse him, and I'll pay you. So Yocheved does that. Now, um, this is Yocheved's reward for disobeying Paro back in her role as Shifra, as the Mielda, the Hebrew midwife, and allowing newborn boys to live. She's rewarded on the same day that she places her son in the river. He's restored to her, and she's able to hold him and nurse him. Not only does she have nothing to fear, but also she's getting paid to nurse her own child. Okay. And that's also a lesson that in God's calculations, that the righteous eventually have their losses restored to them and receive a reward. And then the boy grows up 24 months, according to the tradition, she nurses him. And then I'm in chapter 2, verse 10. The boy grows up, and Yocheved, brings him to the daughter of Paro, and he was a son to her, and she calls his name Moshe, as she said, for drew him out of the water. Okay, so during the time that Moshe is back living with the family, he matures much more rapidly than ordinary child. By the time he's 2, he's like a mature young man. Yocheved brings him back to Paro's daughter to the palace. The princess hugs him, and from then on, he doesn't leave the palace, as if he were actually the princess's son. Um, and all of the Egyptians want to see this princess's adopted son. Even Paro himself, according to our tradition, would play with the child, had no idea he was a Hebrew, which is an indication that God can make miracles right out in the open. She raised him, excuse me, exactly like her own son. And as a reward, according to our tradition, she was one of the people who was allowed to enter Gan Eden when she was still alive, the Garden of Eden, paradise, the world to come, however you understand that. Remember, we talked about that last week when we talked about Serach, that also she never died, but she went to the next world alive. I'll finish with this. She called his name Moshe, for drew him out of the water. So she actually gave him an Egyptian name. Um, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right because I don't speak Egyptian, but I think it's Monios, which means that he was drawn from water. And Moshe is the Hebrew translation of that word, of that name. And she, Moshe has many names. His family named him Tov or Tuvia, but he is known as Moshe all even until today. He was not known by any other name in the entire Torah, as a reward for what she did for him, that even God doesn't call him anything but Moshe. And I'll just have you go to, and with this I'll finish, Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, I think it's First Chronicles, not sure, chapter 4, verse 18, where she is referred to as Batya, the daughter of Paro. This is the first place that she's referred to as by name. Batya literally means Bat Ya, daughter of God. So it's like God says to her, Moshe was not your son, but you called him your son. You are not my daughter, but I will call you my daughter. Okay. So um, that is thank you for applauding. That is the story. So far, we have Moshe's life being saved again and again and again by women. There's yet another episode which we don't have time to talk to. The Chronicles reference is chapter 4, verse 18, but I'm sorry that I didn't write down if it is First Chronicles or Second Chronicles, so you'll have to look it up. But it says, these are the sons of Bacha, the daughter of Paro, who married, it's then it goes on to that. Okay. But that's where she gets her name. That's how we know her name. So I wanted to tell you about this book called Moses. Oops, this Moses's Women. It has a lot of what we talked about tonight, as well as the story of Tzipporah, which is the woman that he eventually marries. I think I'm gonna start with that next week, even though we will have finished this episode. But it is very important, as much of a biblical figure, as much as a biblical hero that Moshe is, and he is, that over and over again that we see that his life was created and sustained by women over and over again, and that without all those women participating and taking care of him, what would be with the Jewish people? What would be with the history? What would be with the Bible? So even though it passes by, if you read the story, thank you, Valerie, it is First Chronicles. If you read in the story, these stories, if you read in the text, these stories pass by, just a few verses, but you should understand the deeper significance of that. Okay, so here's the story. Our time is up. I just want to know before we go, does anybody have any questions or comments before I end the recording? Anybody just unmute yourself and okay, I hope
I
you
just,
got Margaret, you want to say something?
right, I just had one question that I was curious about. Does did Pharaoh's daughter have a husband? Because the way it was explained to me, her husband had died and she was, childless. So according to the rabbis and from the Jewish perspective, did her did she have a husband and what happened to her?
My understanding is that she got married later after this episode. She did get married, she had more children. I believe that to be the case. But she was not married at this time. And I don't think her marriage took place before this. But that's a good question. And now you see, I'm hesitating because I'm not 100% sure. So I'd like to research it for you and get back to you with a more confident answer. Okay. Anybody else? Any comments or questions? Okay. So we'll finish up. We'll finish up for today, and I wish you all a good week. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you.